What's up YouTube? Jessica here. Today I'm going to do a story time video on the time that all of my adult fancy goldfish died. I'm going to go over the events leading up to it and ultimately tell you why it was my fault. So thanks for watching. Let's get into it. So I probably recorded this like 7 times in the last 15 minutes and I can't, it's hard because I'm still one of the people that's using my phone to record these videos, and all of the events that happened last year are all on my phone in pictures, and so I'm not going to be able to access all that until I edit this video and throw in all of those pictures and videos that I have and my notes. So bear with me while I recollect. It has been about 8 months since my goldfish passed away, and it all started last summer, late last summer. It was August, and I had, over the course of the summer, added some new goldfish to my system. My system that had been running smoothly with no hiccups, no diseases, parasites, anything that I was aware of. Everything had been running really smoothly. So I got a little bit slack in my quarantine routines, and I did not quarantine or sanitize my equipment going from tank to tank as well as I could have. So what happened was I added some fish to one of my fry ponds that at the time was outside, and I had several tanks of my own fry that were about 5 months old at the time in the house, and then one outside, and then I had this 65-gallon was holding some of my fancy goldfish. The 75-gallon across from me right now was holding fancy goldfish, and it all started when I noticed the adult fancy goldfish in my 75-gallon started to show symptoms of ick, and that's, you know, white spot disease. They had white spots on their fins, and I'm like, that's weird, because that's not the tank that I added the new fish to. I added the new fish to one of my fry ponds. So again, cross-contaminating with equipment used to clean various tanks. I somehow got something going on in the 75. So I wasn't really that worried about it because I know how to treat ick. So I started treating it, and while I was treating it, all of a sudden, one of my fry tanks got it, and all of a sudden there was ick all over my ping pong demican fry. And I'm like, okay, like that's annoying, because the medication I use, I do daily 25% water changes, and I do the medication for like 14 days. So now I have a 75 and a 65 that I'm going to be doing, and I did 25% water changes and daily dosing of this medication. So whatever, I buy more medication and I get into it. I start to notice that there's an immunity to this medication I have used in the past for ick. It's not working. Whereas before, I've never not had it work. It's, you know, fail-proof for me. I've always had it work. So now I'm getting a little stressed because the ick is actually getting worse after a couple days, a week in the 75-gallon. And I start to get a little frazzled. In the meantime, my Ranchu fry tank gets it. And it kind of starts going like that in all of my goldfish tanks. I don't remember how many I had at the time, but there was probably at least 5 systems of goldfish, maybe 6. None of my planted tanks got it. None of them were involved in this whole thing, just the goldfish. So at this point, I have several tanks that have ick, and normally it doesn't bother me. I treat it and it always goes away, and that's that. So I start looking into other methods on how I could treat it, what is safe for fry. And I think initially what I did was in the 75-gallon with the adult goldfish, I tried to treat them with copper. And so I changed all the water in the tank, made sure there was no medication in it, and I dosed with copper. And after 24 hours, I noticed that one of my goldfish is laying on the ground on his side. He's not taking the copper well. So I immediately get them out of that medication. I take all the fish out of the 75 and I put them in a small 20-gallon tote. And I decide, you know what, I'm gonna treat with old-fashioned heat and aquarium salt. And I'm gonna do it in a small container so that I can afford to dose them with the right amount of salt, and I can get the temperature to where I want it to be with the wattage of heater that I had at the time. So I raised the temperature over time to 83 degrees and 0.3% salinity, and I got that ick taken care of. So that was working. And so then I was starting to implement the salt and heat in all of the other affected tanks. So the long and the short of it is, I didn't lose any fry. I probably had 75 of my fry at the time who all got ick, and they were just, it was unbelievable what they looked like. They were not eating, they were red, they were flashing. It was really bad for a while. I thought it was over for me. I was like, that's it, like it's over. All these goldfish are gonna roast and I'm done. I can't save them. I was trying so hard, and I work full time, and I mean, I was doing daily water changes on like 6 systems at this point. So, and redosing medication and salt and temperature matching, and it was a lot. So I was able to salvage all of my fry, and I did lose 2 of my adult fancy goldfish from the 75 from complications of ick and whatever the actual cause of the ick was, because I assumed that ick was a secondary response. It was a stress response to some kind of parasite or disease or bacteria or microbe that I added to my system, not taking the appropriate and thorough steps of quarantining. So the ick was secondary. So I was treating what I thought might be something like Fluke's parasite, and I was also treating the ick. So going back again with not recollecting everything because it's all on my phone right now, I ended up having to sanitize these systems and these filters probably 3 or 4 times over, because while I did get the ick under control, I had to make sure that I also got what caused it under control. So I went through tank by tank by tank, and I was doing potassium permanganate dips on all of the fry. I was doing 10-minute, 100 parts per million potassium permanganate dips on my fry and my adult goldfish. And then I was returning them to a bleached, sanitized system once that was done. And in some cases, like the 65, I did potassium permanganate tank treatment. And I added a bunch of air stones, and that's a whole different kind of video. I know in a few of my videos I've talked about using potassium permanganate. That was a really a big learning curve for me. I got a gram scale. I ordered the potassium permanganate. I was learning how to measure it. And that was really complicated because depending on organic matter in the tank and oxygen and a number of factors, the dosage was different. And basically the tank water would be purple, and I needed it to stay purple for a matter of 6 to 8 hours. And if it was no longer active in the tank, it would turn tea colored, like brown. So I had to do this several times over in order to get the right dosage that wouldn't nuke the tank and the inhibitants, but it would stay active long enough to kill parasites and diseases. During this time, I also learned how to use a microscope, and I was doing skin scraping, slime coat scrapings on all of the systems. And I'd never really looked in a microscope before. Of course I have in grade school and such, but what do we really remember from elementary school? So I was trying to learn how to do this and figure out what I was looking at. And by the time I learned how to use the microscope, I had done so much with high salinity and potassium permanganate that I was not finding anything alive in any of these slime coat scrapings. So, but I had to make sure that I was actually looking at it right and zooming on it, and it was really complicated. But I did learn, and I was certain that at that point, looking at these slime coat scrapings from multiple systems, that I had absolutely decimated whatever kind of parasite or bacteria that I was dealing with. And all of these fish that I had just slaved over to save, it was successful. So you're talking, you know, upwards of 70 fish. I had 2 die. So I was totally happy with that. I was feeling great at that point. So this is kind of where, this is all the, you know, makeup to what I'm going to tell you next. So the fry pond outside, all of the fry tanks and adult goldfish tanks. I had just made a video that my last video was on my Goldfish Island ping pongs. Those 4 goldfish, they were all part of this. They were not the fish that I added to any of my systems that were responsible for any of this, but they were receiving treatment along with my established goldfish tanks and ponds and the other new fish that I had added over summer. So those 4 goldfish from Goldfish Island that you saw in my last video, they were also survivors of this, and they went through all of those treatments, and they are still here with us today. So I'm very happy about that. But anyway, so after I treated all of these fish inside, I noticed that the only pond of goldfish that wasn't affected or hadn't been was my 230-gallon goldfish pond with all of my adult fancy goldfish that's outside. And they had not been affected up until this point. So it was the 17th of September, and I was coming out of the thick of it with treating these indoor tanks. I was mostly out of the woods, but I was still doing some secondary dips and just finishing up the treatment, and but I was getting ahead of it. So it was the 17th of September, and I especially know that date because my husband surprised me with tickets to see John Mayer in concert. And it was like our first date that we were going on since our son was born 8 years ago. So it was like our first big, you know, we're not just going out to dinner, we're going on a date. So I had gotten off work early that day. I got home and I checked on my tanks and I did my water changes and just made sure that everything was good. I did at this point know that I was coming home to assess and make a plan for my 230-gallon pond, because I did notice that morning before work that that was the last system that had ick. So all of those fish, suddenly they had red marks all over their body and they had ick. So they had the same thing that I had just gotten ahead of in the fish room. So 230 gallons is a larger body of water than I could manage to medicate. So I got a tote. It was like a 50-gallon tote. And I filled it with brand new clean water. And I put so here's what I did. So I filled it with fresh water, but I didn't fill it 50 gallons. I filled it like halfway, 25 gallons. And I was treating approximately 8 to 10 adult fancy goldfish, because knowing I was going to be changing this water every day, I wasn't worried about, you know, 8 or 10 large goldfish going into 25 gallons of water from being in 230 because I had just done this with large fancy goldfish in my 75 gallon and I had treated them in 20 gallons of water successfully with heat and salt inside. So I was like, you know what? I have just done this with success in like 5 tanks inside. I'm gonna do this and I know what to do to save them. So it was a lot. I was really overwhelmed at this point because it was just a lot. So I pulled their pond heater and I filled the tote right next to the pond, so they were gonna still continue to be outside. I filled the tote with 25 gallons of water. I added their heater, and one by one, I dipped every single fish from the pond in potassium permanganate for 10 minutes. Then I added them to the salted, clean, heated water in the tote. So that night we went to the concert. We had a great time. I was really happy. We were really happy. And we came home that night and I did not go back outside to the pond that night. There was nothing more that I was gonna do with the fish, and I figured I would assess it in the morning. That was the plan. When I got up the next morning, I got up late because we were out late. It was probably 10 or 10:30. And I came downstairs like I always do to check all the tanks, but I didn't even come into the fish room. I immediately went outside because they were my main priority at the time. And I opened my sliding glass door to go outside. And the feeling of heat hit me like a hot wall. I opened the door and I immediately felt like a heat wave. And there was a smell. So I knew something was wrong immediately. And I couldn't even see the fish from where I opened the door. It's like the pond is way over from my sliding glass door. And the heat from that system hit me like, it just hit me like a wall. So as I walked around the corner to where I had the tote, I knew right away that they were all dead. So that was shocking. I'm pretty tough these days with fish loss and fish death. It happens. But that was a really hard one to take in because what happened was my pond heater, I'll call it a malfunction, but I'll tell you what happened in a minute. My pond heater malfunctioned and it absolutely roasted my adult fancy goldfish that I had had for some of them almost 2 years. So they all died. The water was murky. The water was so hot that I couldn't even pull the bodies from the tote by hand because it was so hot. So what happened was the heater from the pond, I'm used to the heaters in the house and they all have an internal thermostat within the heater and it regulates the temperature of the water all in one piece. My pond heater is 3 pieces. It's the heater, it's the control panel for the heater, which is mounted outside of the water, and then there's a temperature sensor like antenna that drops into the water, and that relays the message to the control unit, and that relays the readings to the actual heater probe and regulates the temperature. I forgot after having that heater in the pond that it was 3 pieces, and I was just thinking it was 2, and so I just moved the probe into the 50-gallon tote that I was treating the goldfish in, and I turned the temperature. I actually erred on the side of caution in the moment. I wanted to raise the temperature to 83 degrees in that tote for my pond fish, like I had done with my other systems, but I was doing it over time. And I wanted to make sure that that heater wasn't going to overheat the tote since it was such a smaller body of water than the 230-gallon pond. So I had that heater, technically, I turned it to, I think, 74 to err on the side of caution. But I didn't move the temperature sensor into the tote. So the temperature sensor was in my 230-gallon pond the whole time. The probe was in the 25 gallons of water, the 50-gallon tote, and it just never stopped raising in temperature because the pond was dropping in temperature without the heater in it, and it was sending the message to the thermostat that it was not at the heat that I had set it to, and so it just kept rising. I imagine they most likely died while I was at the concert. I don't think that they stood a chance, even if I had checked on them when I got back, being that it was such a small body of water and such a high wattage heater. It was capable of heating 230 gallons rather quickly, and it was in 25 gallons of water. So hopefully that makes sense. So it was my fault. I just forgot. I don't really have any excuse. I definitely was stressed, and I had a lot on my plate at the time, and I didn't take a lot of time to go over what I was doing. I just moved the heater, and I left for the concert thinking that everything was fine. So I was really sad, more just about the way that they died. That was crappy, just thinking of fish overheating to death, and they can't tell you it's happening, and I was too late. So my husband is just such an angel. He told me at the time, he just said, Jessica, you have so much on your plate with all these other fish and everything that's going on. He's like, fate took this off your plate. And even though it's a hard pill to swallow, it was more than you could handle, whether you want to admit it or not. With all the other fish that I was treating, he just said, this is just one of those things that it was too much for you, and you would have never ever admitted it, and fate took it off your plate. So I never really think of fate being a bad thing. I always think of fate being, you know, positive things, but it was a bad thing in that circumstance that happened, but I like to think that he was right. And later that day, I have one of my reef tanks, and at the time I just had one reef tank. It's a 22-gallon reef tank, and I had an anemone in there. It was my first anemone, and I had clownfish in there, and I had had them for several months. The anemone was rather new. I had had it for several weeks, and that afternoon my clownfish started hosting the anemone for the first time. And again, my husband was like, this is your sign that this all happened. I don't want to say for a reason, because I'm not really one of those people, like everything happens for a reason, but this restored my spirit, I think, because I mean, it doesn't seem like a big deal, like clownfish, they go into anemones, but they had ignored that anemone for several weeks. They had not gone near it, and there were no signs of them hosting the anemone. And on the day that my fancy goldfish died, they were in their anemone for the first time. And that was such a, just like saving grace for me. Like, that was so magical. And I was just so thankful to have that happen that day. That really helped me process my, I guess you could call it grief, but that was just shocking. So I was really glad to have my husband by my side, and I was ready to move on at that point. And I was able to then, I ended up turning the temperature in my empty 230 gallon pond. I turned it up to max temp, which was like 95 degrees. And I just turned the heat up and I left that tank empty for like 2 weeks. So I absolutely decimated any kind of parasite or anything that would have been going on in that pond, and I essentially sanitized it with heat. And I did do several potassium permanganate treatments to that pond in addition to the heat. So then at that point, I had room to keep more of my fry than I initially thought I could have room for. So with the loss of my adult fancy goldfish, 2 of them being the parents of my Ranchu fry, I was able to keep more of my fry, and I added them to that sanitized system, and they're out there right now. So that's the silver lining, that I had a lot on my plate during that time, and then I had room to keep my fry, and now I can breed out my fry, and at least I have them. So their parents died, but at least I have them, and now I can breed them out for several more generations. So all was not lost, and I of course, I had a little bit thicker skin after that. I had been getting thicker skin over the course of the 4 years of keeping fish and having losses and things happen, but my skin thoroughly thickened at that point, and I think that's about the time I stopped naming goldfish. Goldfish are not always here for a long time. They're here for a good time, and I definitely give them a good time while they're here. So that's my story. I have a really bad headache now that I've had this ring light in my face, so I can hardly even focus at this point. I need to reevaluate my story time situation. So anyway, thanks for watching, and again, this was about 8 months ago, and I'm looking forward to having a really great spring and summer season with that pond and all of the other fish that I saved from that whole ordeal. I learned a great deal about using a microscope and about treating ick the old-fashioned way with heat and salt, because that is what saved all of my fish. Heat and salt, ultimately, because that medication that I thought was foolproof failed me. So that could have just been that my systems had built up a tolerance to having been treated with it once or twice before over the years, but that did not work. So heat and salt, I can come away telling you that worked. And then learning how to measure and dose potassium permanganate, that was wonderful. So